Today's episode is brought to you by SoundCartel. From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Unhappy with the federal budget? Well, you're not alone. A meagre $325 handout in energy relief won't do much to help struggling small businesses. But Monash University economics professor Robert Brooks says there's an upside with other financial help and even new opportunities. He says tax and structural changes will be far more valuable. Professor Brooks starts by explaining the government's difficult Inflation Balancing Act to Jeff Waters.
It's really been interesting, I think, because the challenge for the budget process has been this: how do you deal with the confidence question? So I think the risk that the government has had to manage, I think, in framing the budget is how do you frame it in such a way that you don't run the risk of creating inflationary pressure in the system, and the inflationary pressure then potentially gets people worried about the future trajectory of interest rates. And the worry about that is it starts to diminish consumer confidence and it puts the economy in a difficult state. So I think the balance has been this question of having had this additional revenue come from the really good situation with commodity prices. How much of that can you use to address cost of living issues, but without creating inflationary pressure in the system? So I think that's the inherent tension that I think's had to be managed. I think it's been interesting to see the mix of where the cost of living relief has been targeted. I think it's been interesting to see a little bit more about the Future Made in Australia initiative and to get a little bit more detail on the specifics of that, because the idea of it's been out there and there's been, one or two specific examples, but there's been detail lacking. Now, there's still the need for a lot more detail there, but I think the budget's articulated quite a bit more of the government's thinking on that. So I think that's useful to have, because in the absence of that, people will fill that vacuum other ways.
Well, let's unpack that. First of all, taking a look at that balance that you say needed to be struck to avoid further inflation. Do you think that the manner in which the government is handing out the energy rebates will be effective in that regard?
The energy rebate one's been really interesting, I think, Jeff, because it's at a technical level in the short term, the energy relief clearly has a technical impact on inflation. As many other people have rightly said, you cannot use price subsidies to get yourself out of a core inflation dilemma. So can you do something around energy costs that have been, higher than I think people had anticipated prior to the last election? So doing something in that space is a good idea. The debate has come up around, do you do the universal piece where everyone gets it, or do you have it more targeted? But the challenge on targeting is, of course, you've got to get the precise rules around targeting done, and you've got to then think about, the costs of how you do that targeting. Because if you don't get those rules carefully thought out, people who do need support miss out. I think part of the idea of doing it through an amount that comes off people's bills is that, are people less likely to see that as a handout, and are they less likely to adjust their other spending in different ways? There's an interesting question if it's sort of distributed across your quarterly electricity bills, how much you're actually going to notice it. I mean, everyone feels better off paying, $75 less for their power, but in the scheme of your overall bill, how much of that are you going to really notice? So it's a nice thing to have. It's worth doing something. There is a legitimate debate always around whether you should restrict access to those, but that's costly to do. And so universality, while it undoubtedly means that some people who perhaps have less of an immediate need for the $75 next quarter are going to get it. But if you have any other rules, then you've got to go through a cost of how you do that, and that's messy. So I think they've gone for the universality piece to be able to do that in a quicker manner and to not have to deal with that customisation. And clearly anyone designing that would have been aware of the cost of doing that in a political sense. But it's also the case that Treasury's looked at the economic side of that. And so that, I don't think in and of itself that's a significant concern in terms of the inflation outlook. How much it's worth politically will depend down the track. The other big piece, of course, has been that the tax cuts come in from the 1st of July. Now, the tax cuts, they'd been on the books for a long time, so they had really been factored into a lot of the inflation forecasting. They got reconfigured in quite a significant way. But in the reconfiguration, I think they were taken into account in the inflation forecasting. Policy stability is really important in that space. So the energy reliefs had a lot of interest. The tax cuts is actually much bigger dollars in people's pockets, however.
There's always a next step for your business. There's always help at every stage. As you grow your business, we're here to support you every step of the way. Move forward with Mazars. Visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.
Still on the energy rebates, is it really going to make any big difference to small business? Because it just seems like as you said earlier, will small business notice it?
Well, it's an every little bit helps, but that's a fair comment, Jeff, around, how noticeable is it going to be? So arguably for small business, the policy configuration around the instant asset write-off being extended for another year is actually a more desirable and more significant piece around business investment. Now, there's been issues around, implementation of the announcement from a year ago and the legislative framework for that. And the extension of that, I think, is a desirable attribute, however, and that's potentially for small business a much more significant amount. So I think the small business dimension to it has been, that's a nicely designed piece of policy. Everyone thinks that's desirable around a business investment and a business support piece. The other bigger challenge for business is making sure that you don't have other policy settings diminish consumer confidence in a much more significant way. So yes, the energy bill relief is nice to have. It adds up a lot when you do it for a lot of people, but for any individual or for any individual business, it is a small amount in the scheme of things.
On the other hand, there may be spoils to be had thanks to the Made in Australia policy. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so the Future Made in Australia policy is one of these interesting initiatives that's come about. So it's certainly the case that part of this is a response to other international initiatives, particularly in the US and Europe, and this idea that post-pandemic your supply chains are more resilient if you can get more local manufacturing.
Bravo.
Yes, indeed. And so thinking how you do that in that space is a really good idea. Of course, the challenge, given the size of the Australian economy and the size of the Australian tax base, is you can never do that at the same scale as the US. So, you cannot outcompete the US initiative in that space, and you can't outcompete a European initiative in that space. So, yes, it's worth doing something, but you have to think about how you're going to be targeted in doing that. But we have from this week got greater clarity on what are a potential set of priorities here.
And there may be some opportunities for Australian small business as a result.
I think so, Jeff. And I think that would be the desirable thing. If you're going to build more of a smart manufacturing base, then you've got to have the business community as an important part of that journey, and you've got to have the incentives. And so people have got to think, what options does this give me around what I'm doing to potentially take forward projects that I haven't been able to do to this point, or to pivot other projects that are currently going on. And hopefully there is that support at the technology end of being able to do this. And ideally we get a set of rules that give people enough confidence and clarity to be able to make that investment. That, I think, is the big part of the challenge. And I think That's always the challenge in this space. You have to try and calibrate your rules. You're not going to get them perfect the first time. You always have to refine. But you can't switch the rules on how you do this too much, but you just create too much uncertainty for people and it diminishes people's confidence. And not everything that you're going to put money in is going to work. The success of this cannot be that every project that it invests in will be a success, but some of them arguably will.
That's Monash University's Economics and Statistics Professor, Robert Brooks. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.